together so that I can speak to you intelligently. How much time do I have to do that? And so you answer the phone and you answer the questions. You're all a very sophisticated group of people, I'm guessing, and the fact of the matter is we hear a lot in politics and in PR about techniques like bridging. You know, you'll get some flack up here saying, you know, you have a core message to deliver, and so the idea is to take the question from the reporter and bridge to your core message. And you can see on a daily basis how stupid and ineffective that is. Just look at Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch was working with Edelman. Edelman, one of the largest public relations firms in the world. And they basically told him, do two things. Say you're sorry, and say you didn't know anything about it. And I don't know if you saw the analysis afterwards. Even though his stock went up, which amazed me, even though his stock went up, all he said were two things. I'm sorry, and I didn't know anything about it. And then you have this phalanx of people, in particular the guy from Adweek, who's written a book about him, spent months with the guy, who comes on right behind that testimony and says, you know, he knows everything that's going on. And they make and you would think that the PR firm would know that this kind of analysis is going to come right out afterwards, and that they would give him a little bit more information to share with the public. So when you get a question, answer it. Answer the question. Like you're talking to somebody in a bar. Don't let anybody, if you're working with a PR firm, don't let anybody tell you, you know, bridge to your central message. There's no central message. They want to know certain things from you. Tell them what you think. That's why they're calling you. Many, many, many years ago, I met a guy over the phone who is now dead. I mourn his death to this day. I called him up, and he's a bankruptcy lawyer by the name of Bill Camp. And Bill Camp was, at the time he was at Frederickson, and he was this brash New York guy, and I called him up. I didn't know, I was an English major at the time, a very early stage business reporter, and I didn't know dog do about business. And I called him up and I asked him this basic question about a company and what was going on with the filing. And he said, let me step back for a little bit. We're going to go on background. And I'm going to tell you what's going on, and I'm going to explain to you what you need to know. And I almost dropped to my knees as a reporter. I was so grateful that this person was willing to educate me. And there are a lot of reporters out there. If you're willing to pull away the curtain of our industry and explain to them why they should be looking at something, and instead of looking at this number, don't look at this number. Look at this number here. And it might not always be in your best interest to have them look at that number. But if you are willing to tell them something that is useful and that makes them look smart, they're human beings just like you. And again, as a former reporter, I can't tell you the number of times. One of the reasons I got out of writing a column for the Star Tribune is that I can't tell you the number of times when 6 months after I had written something, somebody from your community, from the investment community, would come back and say, you know, Tony, you really didn't get that story. And what you should have been looking at is this, and this. And I would just about scream over the phone, why didn't you tell me that 6 months ago? And so any person who picks up the phone and answers the phone as a potential source and is helpful in a way that will protect the journalist from looking stupid in front of 300,000 potential readers is going to win the undying fealty of that reporter. You'll make a friend, and they will cut you breaks. When I first arrived here in 1980, none of you were born. I was taken out to lunch with a number of the reporters at the paper, and a woman named Kathy Skiba, just a delightful person. She said, if there's anything you never ever forget about Minnesota, and about Minneapolis in particular, is that this is a really, really small town. And unlike New York, unlike Chicago even, this is the kind of market where you meet yourself coming around the corner every other day. And so if you establish a worthwhile relationship with a reporter and you don't burn that person, they will come back and they'll pay you back time and again with additional phone calls, with consideration, where if you are in a little hot water and you say, you know what, here's the real story, can you phrase it in such a way that I don't look like a screaming criminal, because I'm not, and they'll try to accommodate you within the boundaries of truth, and they'll cut you some slack. It's not unusual at all for any reporter working a small isolated beat will always hold stuff back. And I know that sounds unethical, but information is currency. Adam actually helped me with some research. I'm going to publish in Twin Cities Business Magazine. I write a column called Context, and it's about profits and politics and all this, whatever I want to write about, basically. But I'm writing about a company here in town, a local company that really has gotten itself into some PR trouble in terms of investor relations and the kind of things that have appeared about that company. And it is a devastating story. And I consciously held back, partly because of space, because you can't get into all that stuff. I consciously held back a few facts. I said, so that if this guy hits the ceiling and comes back and said, you really filleted me, I will be able to say, I could have talked about this, I could have talked about this, and I could have talked about this. And you are lucky I didn't. Reporters do this all the time, especially in a small town. I used to sit next to a guy named Joe Blade. Joe Blade was a financial writer who taught me a lot about financial reporting. But Joe Blade was always, throughout his career, a go-for-the-jugular kind of guy. And he knew more about finances and more about banks than anybody I've ever met. And he knew how reserves were established, he knew the accounting laws. He was really, really good. But he was also a bulldog. And he saw himself as Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein rolled up into one guy. As his career proceeded to wind down, I remember sitting next to Joe in the business section of the Star Tribune and watching him place phone call after phone call after phone call and sit and wait for people to call him back. Nobody's getting back to me. And finally I wanted to turn to him and say, Joe, you burned everybody in this town. Of course they're not going to call you back. And that is the way this town operates. And reporters know that. And you can work with the toughest, most unforgiving reporter, but they recognize that they are going to have to barter in information. And unlike the Journal, which can swoop in out of the sun and take somebody's company apart on the front page because they know they're never going to have to talk to them again, our local media don't operate that way. And so answer the question. Be honest. Be honest. The first time a reporter catches you in a lie will be the last time you talk to them. It's that simple. Especially if it gets into print or on the web. In print is one thing, the paper goes away, but if it's on the web, it never goes away. It's there in perpetuity. So answer the question. Be direct. Be direct. Here's the answer to your question. I don't know right now, but I'll get back to you with some data. And do be careful about getting, that's another PR trick. You know, if you want to stall, PR people will tell you, say, can I get back to you on that? And I remember hearing that from PR people all the time. And then I'd call somebody up, and if there were too many, I'm going to get back to you on all this type answers, I concluded that they didn't know what they're talking about. Also, be careful of quoting things that they can get publicly. In 1989, we had a total revamp of the U.S. tax code. And I was a financial services writer at the time, and I did a long series about the tax code and how this was going to change. And we had at the time 8 major accounting firms plus some, and I crafted this like 10-part series. And I called the big 8 accounting firms and 1 or 2 really good regional accounting firms. And I said to them, if you want to be in the paper, I'm going to do a subject, and this is your subject to talk to me about. And I'll be over, and you give me your 2 best experts to talk about this particular subject. Alternative minimum tax, what has changed, why it's important, why it's not important. And this just reinforces the point that I've been making over and over here. Out of the 10 firms that I interviewed, 2 of them, the lead guys, a guy named Tom Sherman, and I'll tell you this from the get-go, at Coopers and Lybrand, now Price Waterhouse Coopers, and a guy named Steve Moosbrugger from Ernst & Young. Out of 10 or 12 interviews with 10 or 12 different people, those were the only 2 people who put the subject into English. And they were the only 2 accountants after that I ever went back to, because everybody else sat there and recited statutes to me. So as investors, you can I worked with one of my firms just recently on the interpretation of the difference between a fiduciary and a registered advisor, an RA and a broker-dealer, and what Dodd-Frank was going to do to change that, and what would happen, for instance, to the business model of most of the wirehouses. And I spent, I don't know how long with my clients saying, if you tell him this, he's going to cut the interview short. Explain to them why, explain to this guy why the business model for a lot of the wirehouses is basically at risk. If suddenly a fiduciary standards apply to the broker-dealer universe. And so those kinds of things, if you can pull back. And then I also talked to the reporter. And I said, my client not only is a registered investment advisor and carries a fiduciary responsibility, but he also has a BD license. And so he can talk to both points. And the reason he has the BD license is that he does some basic trades, restricted stock, unsolicited type things. But I'm going to tell you something. If you try to drag out of him where his broker-dealer license is housed, he will have to clam up. And so I protected my client because he didn't want to disclose his BD, because all of a sudden he has tons of regulatory issues, begin to rear their ugly heads. And then but at the same time, he was willing to talk about what it was like to be both an RA and a broker-dealer.